Okay, so welcome back to the afternoon session, part 3. So just as a quick summary of what we've covered kind of in the morning section, really, very much kind of starting with this pivot from oppressive to anti-oppressive practice, thinking about the broader framework of working within diversity and the need and importance for that. And then before the lunch break, we were thinking about the component of power, and specifically about role power and how we might utilize our power to either reinforce and collude with that unequal power in terms of that kind of seesaw of inequality, and how we can think about being intentional about being able to bring that back into equality as well. So thinking about that power before the break. What we're going to be thinking then about in part 3 and for kind of the rest of this afternoon really then is the component, or it's not a component of the model, but rather a concept within the model, that of cultural attunement. And I know that I've kind of mentioned it already today. Where I suppose I place this within the model itself is the reason why it's not a component of the model. It's because it's a concept that we need to consider within every layer of all of those 5 components of the model. So when we think about identity, when we think about power, when we think about therapeutic relationship, when we think about process, within all of those components, we need to think about how are we not only attuning to our clients, but how are we contextualizing diversity, identity, and culture when we are working within diversity. Sorry, there's a car alarm going off. I hope that's not disruptive to all of you. So, as I said, when we now think about thinking about cultural attunement, that's why it's a principle, a foundational principle to the entire model, because we are working with it and thinking about it at every component level of the model itself. So I'm going to screen share in a moment my definition and what my understanding of cultural attunement is. Before I share the definition of cultural attunement, again, where I place this within anti-oppressive practice is cultural attunement is a principle, as it is in the model. It is a principle of anti-oppressive practice. So again, to be culturally attuned, to work in being culturally attuned to our clients, and to offer cultural attunement is, again, to be intentional about it, because it kind of belongs after that we've pivoted into anti-oppressive practice. It's a principle of anti-oppressive practice. We cannot offer cultural attunement or be culturally attuned to our clients if we are not doing it intentionally and consciously. And also, it does not fit within the oppressive position of working with diversity. And the reason I say that is because cultural attunement is a way of being, a process. It is part of the work we do. It is not a thing that we attain that is like a tick box that we get to the finish line in. And therefore, it is not cultural competency. So when we pivot from oppressive to anti-oppressive, we are pivoting from working with to working within. We are also then pivoting from cultural competency model to a cultural attunement model. So where cultural attunement sits within working within diversity and within an anti-oppressive position, it is the opposite to cultural competency, that is a working with diversity approach or position. And why I say that is because cultural competency is born out of a position that we can be competent in something. Yes. And in this case, cultural competency is saying to us, we can be competent in culture, which in a moment, I'll tell you all the reasons why that doesn't work. But if we deconstruct the term, the concept of cultural competency, it tells us we can be competent in culture, which indicates or infers that there is therefore a finish line that we can get to. If we can be competent in something, it means that there is a predetermined standard or finish line or tick box or criteria that we can achieve, and that once we've achieved it, we are forever more competent. Because once we've finished that, once we've crossed that finish line, or once we've ticked that box the first time, that gives us it's a bit like passing your driving test, that forevermore then you are competent in driving. But let's just stick with that idea that or that understanding that cultural competency is a finish line. If it is therefore a finish line, it means that someone somewhere has determined what it is, the actual content of what it is you actually need to know in order to be determined or proven as competent. Yes. And that competency model not only will have a set of standards or criteria, it becomes the finish line that someone has decided that is the very thing you need to know in order to be culturally competent. And with it being a standardized competency model, it indicates then that not only is it predetermined, but it also then assumes that culture is fixed, that there is a finite amount of informational knowledge that you need to know about culture in this point and place in time and in society and in culture that you need to know, and that you are therefore deemed competent to know about it. Also, the competency model is based upon what you know, what you cognitively and consciously have learned, and the skills and knowledge that you have been taught. None of it is relational practice based in how you be or how you are. It is what you know. So cultural competency, or any competency model, is a cognitive skills and knowledge based model of criteria that by attending that CPD or course, or by doing that, whatever qualification or course that may be, they have determined that you have ticked those boxes, and therefore from this moment on you are competent in knowing about that information, whatever that information might be. So you can start to see where this is going to be problematic in the world of anti-oppressive practice, because the moment we say that we are culturally competent, we are setting ourselves up by saying that we have a finite and particular amount of knowledge, cognitive knowledge, skills and understanding about culture, and that culture is what we have defined it as based on whatever model it is that and whoever is teaching us. Now, the problem with all of that is that culture is not finite. It is infinite, and it is always evolving and moving and shifting. So we can never actually be competent in culture, because there is no finish line. And there is also no finish line because when we are working in an anti-oppressive way, which is relational, and we are relating to people's lived experience born out of their identity in society right now, within historical, social, cultural, political contexts out there, there is no finish line, because it is always evolving and moving and changing. And ultimately, we can never be competent in a client's lived experience. That's impossible. So cultural competence very much lives within a working with diversity model that tells us we can learn and know about this other, this diversity as an identity position. Yeah. So what we are shifting from, what we are pivoting from, is a cultural competency model that is inherently oppressive for those reasons I've just mentioned. And we are moving and pivoting into an anti-oppressive model and position that recognizes that culture is infinite, And we can never be competent in a client's truth because we can never know everything about a client's truth. And also, it is not about knowing, it's not about doing, it is about being, it is about relationship. So we are shifting into what I have coined as the concept of cultural attunement. And this is all about being and relating and not knowing and doing. So cultural competency moves us away from trying to, sorry, let me say that again. Cultural competency that tries to get us to a finish line and, all right, tick box, here's your certificate, you're all competent. Instead, cultural attunement shifts us away from trying to run and chase and hunt down that finish line. And that finish line actually is nothing about the client, it's about us as well. Instead of chasing down a finish line, cultural attunement instead places us back on the starting line, and is telling us that we are always learning about our client from our client. Yeah. That it's through our work with our clients, supervisees, that we are always learning. So there is no competency model here. There is no finish line. We will never get to a position where any of us are finished in our work of being anti-oppressive practitioners. We are always on that starting line because we are always evolving and learning, not only about our clients and their lived experiences, but also about ourselves. Okay. So cultural attunement absolutely rejects the idea of competency because it's not about what we know up here. Rather, attunement takes us to a place of kind of down here in our guts, in our hearts, in our soul. And it is about how we be and how we relate with and to our clients. And that pivot of cultural competency into cultural attunement, what that is actually doing from a power position is moving us away from power over, oppressive power. I know about you. I'm competent to know about your culture, into a power within. Yeah. Cultural attunement is all about let's find power within and within our relationship in order for me to learn about you. I don't know more than you, I'm not ahead of you, and I'm not going to say that I'm an expert. I do not have the lived experience, I do not have your lived experience, and I'm not here as the pardon me, I've got hiccups, and I'm not here as the expert. So one way of moving, that hierarchy, that seesaw, one way of leveling out the playing field is to move from a competency model into an attunement model, a cultural attunement model. So what that actually means, and again, I'm going to slide share, bring up the right slide. So what I then actually mean by, let me just bring it up, there we go. What I actually then mean by cultural attunement. A reminder then that it's a principle of anti-oppressive practice rather than a component of it. Cultural attunement, and this is the direct definition taken from the book. To be culturally attuned is to encompass and embody cultural curiosity, cultural humility, and cultural empathy. It is for us to be intentionally placed in a position of practicing, having, and offering all these three qualities as cultural attunement to clients. So cultural attunement is encompassing, embodying, practicing, and offering these three parts: cultural curiosity, cultural humility, and cultural empathy. And for me, it's really important that we acknowledge that we need to do all three because they are not the same thing, but combined, they are incredibly powerful for us to be able to offer something that is anti-oppressive. And I'm going to give a definition of each of those three in a second. But I just want to really acknowledge here that we often hear people use the word humility, like cultural humility, and then the next minute they're talking about cultural sensitivity, and then they might be talking about cultural empathy. I want us to recognize, in cultural curiosity, and I want us to recognize that there are three distinct aspects of cultural attunement. And the moment we encompass and embody all three as cultural attunement, we can then offer cultural sensitivity in our work. We cannot offer cultural sensitivity through only one of them or two of them. It has to be a combination of all three within this anti-oppressive position. And if you notice here as well, it is for us to be intentionally placed in the position of practicing, having, and offering all of these three qualities. As I said, because if we don't intentionally offer all three, we fall back into cultural competency. And so you can start to see how cultural competency is all about what I know versus anti-oppressive practice and cultural attunement is all about how do I relate and how do I be with my client. It's all in the human being rather than the cultural competency, which is as a brain I am doing. I always say this thing about, we're human beings, not human doings. So what we are being here is we are embodying and embracing what it is to be human. This is where the humanity comes back into our work. This is where we recognize that we are two people in the room, and it absolutely takes us away from that authoritative expert position of knowing and being that helper from a power over oppressive position. And it takes us away from being that expert and saying, right, you're coming to me for help. I have the answers and I know best. In a way, this absolutely checks us to make sure that we do not take up that dominant oppressive position. So that's the definition of cultural attunement. I'm going to walk us through then the definition of the three: cultural curiosity, humility, and empathy. And again, just as a reminder, it's about doing all three, encompassing and embodying all three together combined. So cultural humility is to be respectful of people's experience of social systemic inequalities and their social locations. So it's humility in which we are respectful that people have their own truth and their own experience in systemic and structural frameworks, that they each have, that we're respectful that each of us have our experiences of privilege and oppression. And we're not saying that one is better than the other, or one is right and one is wrong, or one is truthful, one is false. It's not doing that. It's holding humility and equality to people's experiences. And therefore, cultural humility invites us to take up a position of humility and non-judgment to everyone and to the diverse lived experiences they have had. So what we're not doing is we're not judging that, oh, you experienced that, well, you didn't have it as bad. Or, oh, you're telling me that, but did that really happen? Or if you've got a client that's talking about, I don't know, experiencing racism, we're not questioning it. We're not going, was it really though? Equally, we're the one not doing that to the client either. We're not being oppressive ourselves, and we are not doing any type of like microaggressions towards them. So humility, cultural humility, is not just an equality of lived experiences, but it's a humility to say that I have my lived experience, and to be humble in the respect that we then give to everybody else's. Yeah. So it's a position of humility, not only in relationship to the person, but it's humility in relationship to their lived experience as well. So this is what takes it beyond just humility. Cultural humility is humility not just for the person, but also for their truth, for their lived experience. And we are not making any judgment about one being better than the other, that we can hold everybody's diverse lived experiences equally. So that's cultural humility. Alongside being humble, having cultural humility, we are also offering cultural empathy. We're empathizing. And again, beyond empathy as a core condition, cultural empathy is to take up a position of openness and willingness to see the client fully in their intersectional identities and to empathize with their experiences and be willing to feel and be affected by their lived experiences. Empathy 101 is to feel what the client is feeling. Cultural empathy is to not only feel what the client is feeling, but also be willing to feel and see the client fully in their intersectional identity, and then to empathize not just with how they feel, but also with their experience, and be willing to feel and be affected by their lived experience as well. So it's beyond. So an example of this might be, if a client is experiencing some racism, it is not only to sit and empathize with how they feel about it, but it is the willingness to sit with and empathize with the experience of racism itself, and to be willing to feel what that feels like. So we are sitting with and empathizing with not just the feeling, but the context, environment, situation, and experience that results in that feeling. Yeah. So we're putting back all the context back into it. So it's not just feeling the feeling, it is sitting with and holding and feeling the experience of it as well, and to empathize with all of that. So that's cultural empathy. And the third component, cultural curiosity. It is the curiosity to approach our work and clients from a position of curiosity and interest. So we are being curious and interested in the client, but also to allow then the work between us to unfold from a place of not knowing. So moving away from a competency position and into a place of not knowing, being on the starting block, and offering the space for clients to make meaning themselves of their lived experience. So again, we are not there to do the meaning making for them. Again, this links back to components such as we're not the expert, we're moving away from that competency model, but also, again, if we think about power, the component of power in this, we are absolutely moving away from power over. I'm the expert, I'm competent, I know best, I'm going to tell you how I make meaning of this. And instead, I'm going to sit in a place of cultural curiosity, and I'm going to sit in our power between or within relationship. And by facilitating my curiosity and interest, and by facilitating an open conversation, I'm supporting my clients to let that unfold for us so they can then make meaning themselves. And whatever meaning the client makes of it, that is their truth. So we are not there as the expert, as knowing, as having answers. And it's not our job equally to make that meaning ourselves and to tell our clients this is what it means, because all of that is competency and all of that is oppressive. So for me, it's always about coming from a place of curiosity. And that curiosity comes with a freedom to not know. And I much rather prefer to be in this work and to do this work with my clients from a place of not knowing, because I don't want to have to hold the responsibility of knowing. Because where would I get the answers from? I don't have the answers. Nor can I make meaning of my client's lived experience for them, but from my lived experience or from my perspective or frame of reference. We are there as the facilitator for them to make meaning. We are not there as the answer or to provide the answer. So when we combine this cultural empathy, humility, and curiosity, we are always then in relationship to the client, to their lived experience, and we are relating to them from this place of a starting block, from a place of not knowing. So what we can then do is our job of facilitating a process, the unfolding of the exploration, in order for the client then to make sense of it for themselves. Okay, so it's a combination of those three. I'm going to go back. So I'm going to go back then to that original definition that I had up. Now that we've gone through the three of them, as a reminder then, to be culturally attuned then is to encompass and embody that cultural curiosity, that position of not knowing. Cultural humility, we are holding the client's lived experience in the context of structural and systemic inequality. And we are culturally empathizing not only with the feeling, but also with the situation, context, environment that causes that experience and the feelings as well. So we are empathizing not just with the feeling, but everything in the context that gives rise to that feeling. And as it says here, we need to be intentionally placed to be practicing, having and offering and being these three qualities in cultural attunement with our clients. And we're going to go in and think about examples of this afternoon, but as a concept, as a way of being with our clients, I'm just going to invite everybody just for the next minute or so, just to sit with this. What does this feel like for you? What does this mean for you in your practice? And then I'm going to open it up for a discussion. But just to start with, I'm just inviting space for reflection individually. Where does this where might this or where does this concept then of cultural attunement sit with you? What does it mean for you? And if you individually do that, and then we'll bring it for a conversation. So again, capturing your thoughts, reflections, questions, feelings about this. So maybe inviting you to think about where might this sit with you in your practice. Does it already, or where would you like to bring it into your practice? How might that feel in your relationships with your clients? Just going to give it a few more moments and I'll bring it back into gallery. Tanya, I see your hand up, so we'll come to you first when we come back to the gallery. So just as a reminder, so culturally attuned is to encompass and embody all these three: that cultural curiosity, being on the starting blocks, being curious about your client's lived experience. Cultural humility is about having humility, not just for the client, but their lived experience and their place in that structural and systemic frameworks. And cultural empathy, empathizing not just with the client's feeling, but also experience, lived experience itself. And that lived experience being, existing within these structural and systemic contexts. So what does it feel like to do what might, so inviting you to think about how do you feel to do that, or how does it feel to bring that into your work, into your practice? I appreciate that it can feel like such a big shift and pivot from maybe you've learned about a cultural competency model, or you've done CPD training that's about these are the things you need to know about your clients, very much a working with position, and to kind of pivot away from that and intentionally be being something different. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing and bring it back to gallery view. So Tanya, I believe your hand was up first. Then we'll come to Alina and then Yvette.
Hi. Yeah, this actually feels really comfortable. I guess I've always struggled with the model and framework of cultural competency purely because it is very easy to understand how little I actually understand of other people's culture. So I could never really find myself feeling competent enough. And I guess because curiosity is, I guess, a key component of any kind of therapeutic work that I do. I've always worked from a position of cultural humility. I guess I never fully understood perhaps the specific differences between every single element of it. And I don't think I've ever really referred to it as cultural attunement. But I guess this is exactly what I have been doing in my practice without really realizing. I think some of these components, if you take a more if you take a more dynamic, or if you take, because I use a lot of the power threat meaning framework, for
Mhm.
example, it lends itself really nicely to this. But I think it's really nice to have it explained in this way, because one of the things that I sometimes find really difficult to do, or not difficult to do, but that becomes uncomfortable, is
Mm.
supervising colleagues that don't fully buy into this, and not wanting to buy into it, not because they are opposed to it, but because they struggle
Yes.
with, specifically around the empathizing with somebody else's lived experience,
Mhm.
becomes a really difficult thing to do when you see yourself through their lenses as an oppressor or part of the oppressing. And so it's really nice to have this, I guess, to use in supervision to explain and to create a framework to say, look, this is what we are doing. So it also doesn't feel as, sometimes it might feel quite personal
Yes.
for people. So yeah, so I really like this. So this for me is it's really
Mhm.
important. So thank you.
Yeah. And if you are a supervisor, so Tanya, you spoke about work using this with your supervisees. If for anyone else in the group who's also might be a supervisor, in the book there's a whole chapter of how this is then applied to anti-oppressive supervision. So there's a model in the book that's an anti-oppressive supervision model. So taking all the components of the working within diversity model and all the components of anti-oppressive and all the principles, including cultural attunement, and it's then devised into an anti-oppressive supervision model. So when you're supporting practitioners to not only do that in their own practice, but then also to explore it in supervision, that model helps you to have that exploration with them. So yeah, that's so I really appreciate, Tanya, that you're saying that, yeah, you can see how this is also applicable to supervision. It absolutely is. Yeah. Thank you, Tanya. Alina, please.
So I really like this model. I appreciate that there's still like a lot of curiosity and it sort of really individualizes the person is like,
Mhm.
okay, you are not just this culture, you were like there, you're this whole other person, and how this culture may affect you is very different for each person. But I'm also wondering if there is like a little bit of a balance to just understand conceptually how someone's culture might be functioning in that sense, because for example, I worked in Tanzania for a few months and I worked with a collectivist community. And before I started working, I was sort of briefed on just what that specifically meant. And so I'm a little bit like, I like the idea, but I also don't know if there's like a balance that could be found just to
Yeah.
conceptually understand culture.
Yeah.
So I like know, because I can imagine that it might be really difficult for a client to try and always explain what's going on, how their culture functions, and having to explain it to a therapist who might not really know what's going on, and that might be quite tiring. So I'm wondering if there's some sort of balance that can be sort of achieved, even if it's just conceptually.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I talk about cultural competency as step one. It
Okay.
very often when we're taught a cultural competency, we see it because competency is about getting to a finish line. It's
Mhm.
also taught as the finish line. Whereas for me, anything that is about you learning about something, it can be to do with culture, it can be to do with religion, it could be to do with anything, sexuality, gender, anything that is about us as the practitioner learning about from a broader perspective about a culture or a faith or gender, whatever it might be. That for me is that for me is step one competency, which is you go away and read about it, go and do CPD on it, go and research it yourself.
Mm.
Anything that is about us learning about a particular identity to give context then or an avenue into learning about the client, that then is step one competency. You do that outside of session. A, you do that outside of session, and B, you do not use your time in session to learn that from your client. Your client is not there to teach you about a general identity, characteristic, or community. So for me, competency becomes a prerequisite to cultural attunement, not the start and finish line. So there's that.
Uh,
And then second of all, um, when we then go away and learn about that particular community, whatever it might be, with whatever identity we're particularly exploring with our client, we are using that to inform how we can attune to and be curious with our client. So once we've kind of gone away and learned something and read about that particular identity or community, that then sits in the background to when we are then in the session with our client, and we then are being curious about our individual client's lived experience of it. And it's not to say, oh, well, I learned this, what's your experience? But rather, when we're being curious with our client, we are saying, okay, we've now learned this about our client. What I have learned, is it relevant or not? We're not taking our client and putting it into that and going, right, how does my client fit? It's more the other way around. This is my client's experience. Whatever I've gone away and learnt about, does any of it fit? Is any of it relevant? And if it is, great, it can help me. But if it's not, leave it behind. So yeah, so it works that way around. Does that make sense?
So it's like twisting it the other way around,
Yeah.
essentially. Learning about
So
the others.
oh, sorry, Alina, say that again because it cut out for me. It's the other way around.
You learn about your client first and then perhaps different fragments of the identity.
Yes. Because the moment, yeah, we need to turn it around, because it's whatever the client is bringing to us in sessions. And again, in the meantime, we're filling out the identity wheel. That will also help us to go away and do a bit of competency reading. But that competency stuff that we've learned does not power over and oppress the client's lived experience. The stuff we might be learning about in our own time is there to help guide us or inform us, or to help us have some information. So when the client is sharing their lived experience, we might have a better understanding of context to put it in. But what we absolutely don't do is let the competency stuff that we have learned be the truth of the client. It's the other way around. It's what's the client's truth, and whatever competency stuff that I've learned, does it fit with, does it help me to understand better the client's truth? And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, just drop it. The other reason why also it's the other way around is because the reason we flip it round is if we didn't flip it round and we only went and read about the competency, if we went and did the competency piece, if we only went and read about the aspects of identity that were in the assessment for the client, guess what? We would be falling back into working with diversity again, wouldn't we? We'd go, oh, I'm working with, rather than within, I'm working with a X, Y, or Z client. I'm working with a Muslim client. I'm working with a I don't know, transgender female client. So quick, let me go and read everything about transgender. All of a sudden, then what we're doing is we are minimizing our client back into diversity. And we fall into the trap of working with diversity, and hence the competency stuff comes first. For me, it's always the client comes first. And if there is anything more general that I can learn about that client's particular identity, community, or any aspect of their lived experience more generally, then that's my homework to do away from the session. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely, we flip it round. We're client-led. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Alina. That's really, really helpful, I think, for the group to understand that. Yeah. Yvette, please. Oh, you're muted, Yvette.
I was just going to say, I just think it's just a bit of an observation, really. I find that really makes perfect sense, the attunements. And I would like to think that on reflection, that I probably do a lot of cultural curiosity, I think. What I've kind of recognised that this is all complex anyway, and it's kind of, like you say, it's on a spectrum. And what I've kind of recognised is that, you know, we can all learn about different cultures. However, we have to recognise that there is also issues and sometimes dynamics within cultures. So we have shadism, you know, we have all of those kind of things, and beliefs and castes and all of these. So I work in particular with people from some of my young people are from Eritrea, Somalia, Iran, Afghanistan, Eastern European. So there's a whole mix and blend of cultures. And what I'm really noticing is because of their developmental stage. They're looking more of who they are and who they fit. And there's a big disparity between who they feel that they are and parents' beliefs. And so it's kind of like they've got one foot in the westernized culture, and it causes a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like I sit with where that kind of, there's a lot of conflict that's raised in household because they think that they're not on dean, and all of these kind of things. So I just sit, but I recognize that that's because they've only been in the UK for a certain amount of time. They're just finding its developmental stage and identity, and also it's a peer, isn't it, when they all will go along. So it is quite complex, but as long as I stay in with my clients and what they present, that's where I'm kind of moving with them, if you see what I mean, because I know that this journey is very fluid. So it's just an observation. That's what I was just kind of thinking, how does that fit into with the internal of the culture and identity and values and beliefs? Because I'm seeing that a lot of conflict within family dynamics of kind of things as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, Yvette, because I think that kind of thing links back to who was it? Alina was talking about kind of this balance between competency and attunement, which is we could, if we wanted to, go away and do a whole load of reading about the to be competent, and then we bring all of that supposed knowledge and expertise into the room, only then for us to allow that to dominate the filter through which we see our client, and then we're trying to fit our client to what we know. And I think that's one of the real problems with the competency model, which is, but if my client doesn't fit it, I'm lost. Oh God, what? And actually, competency is about the counsellor's ego. It's about the counsellor going, yes, but I know and I should know. And I'm going, no, we should know nothing. We should go in being curious and not knowing. It's not about us knowing so that the client makes sense to us. It is about not knowing in order to be curious and to explore with the client their lived experience so they get to know who they are. It's not for us to sit and go, oh, well, I now know the client. I can now make sense of the client. So it is this balance between, yes, you can go away and do your reading and kind of, kind of get yourself up to speed maybe with some cultures and certain, or not cultures, but certain communities and identities. But it's there more like a reference, not the guide to knowing about your client. It might give you a framework, it might give you some points of reference, but it is not there as the lens through which to see your client or work with your client. And I think that's the difference. I think a competency model becomes the filter or the lens for which we then go, well, I know all of this stuff. I'm going to place my clients in this lens or through this lens. And that's really problematic. It's saying, I've learned some stuff about cultures or identities or communities, but I put that to one side until I know what's relevant from learning about my client or from my client. Yeah. So thank you, Yvette, for sharing that. Yeah. Mona, please.
It's interesting what you were just saying there, kind of on reflection to Yvette, because to me, cultural competency, I found a lot of safety in that kind of model, because it's really easy to go away and learn and gain knowledge. Particularly for me, I'm academic and I enjoy reading and reading memoirs, and I love it. I enjoy it. I do all the YouTube videos and all that kind of stuff. So there's a real kind of like your point about it being an ego, like it really is, because it's reinforcing identity for me. It's reinforcing like an element of myself that I like. I like that I'm academic. It's done me wonders in terms of my life. It also as well, sometimes in the therapeutic space, it can also give me an ego boost, because if I know certain terminology, or if I know certain language, or I know what people are referring to, they can, like, the client can like appreciate that. So it's almost like a way for me to like give myself a pat on the back. Oh, look, you were a good therapist because you knew what the hell that word meant or what that person's going on about.
Yeah.
So kind of like to be culturally competent, it's not easy per se, but it's also easy to like hide behind it or like think you're doing a good job when actually you're not necessarily doing it for all the things that you said. I guess also as well, So there's that aspect. And like this idea about attunement of like completely makes so much more sense because it also as well like is a bit of an equalizer because every client in front of you is going to have culture. And so you're going to be looking for that cultural attunement for every client, not just the ones that you're perceiving as other or different or not like me or whatever it might be, or have a minority identity. It's kind of like everybody in front of you is going to have their own particular culture going on. And I guess it also as well, I wonder if it's also I'm going to maybe take away and think a little bit about my own cultural attunement with myself. And kind of maybe it's a way for me to think about the different identity categories that you presented. Kind of, yeah, it's another way for me to think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Min. I think you bring up some really important points there. Starting with that last one around cultural attunement, I suppose an alternative to cultural attunement is identity attunement. So we're attuning to the whole client's identity in Rubik's Cube. And so when we're attuning to their entire Rubik's Cube, absolutely, the first person we need to attune to is ourselves. So we have to attune, first of all, and be aware of our own identity in order to then recognize, how am I attuning to somebody else's identity? And again, what am I, what aspects of identity are easier to attune to? Which ones are safer and more comfortable for me? And which aspects of identity and lived experience do I find more uncomfortable? Which ones do I lean out of? Because however we relate to our own identity and lived experience, whatever it is that we're more comfortable sitting with in terms of our own experience, and which ones we shy away from or don't go near, guess what? We're going to be doing the exact same with our clients. So the stuff that I feel safer to talk about or acknowledge within my own lived experience, I'm absolutely going to feel more comfortable doing that with my client. But equally, if there are aspects of my lived experience, either through privilege or through oppression, that I then that feel really uncomfortable for me, which I'm really defended against, that are really painful for me, guess what? Those similar or shared experiences with my client, I'm also going to want to stay away from as well. So we absolutely have to be better attuned to ourselves first and foremost, to then be able to better attune with our clients. So I think that's a really good point there, Mona, that you're making. Also, going back to your previous point about that safety piece, that ego piece. If we think about safety in what we know, we feel this is where the competency position is. Competency reinforces the idea of knowing, and knowing makes us feel safe. And what makes us feel safe through the knowing is that we then have a level of power, control, agency, autonomy, and also a level through that knowing, we might also have almost a level of what might feel like familiarity or predictability. So there's something about when we then explore with our clients from a place of cultural competency, we can then explore from a place of, it's a bit like, whenever I think of kind of exploring and being curious about a client's lived experience, it's the equivalent of being a tourist. There is a difference between being a tourist in a place that you've been to before versus a place that you've never been to. A place you have been to before, because you have been there before, it's going to feel safer, it's going to feel more familiar. You know what's coming up ahead of you. Cultural competency, wrongly, and actually quite unrealistically, sets you up thinking that you're going to know what's about to come up, or you're going to know what's further down the line. And therefore, it reinforces the need to know. Because the moment you don't know, you then are going to go, oh no, now I'm incompetent, I can't go there, or I'm incompetent, therefore I can't work with this client, or I can't go there with this client, or before we go there, I need to, we can't go there this session, I need to then spend the week reading about it. So competency also gives us this false impression that we should be feeling okay and safe with what we're about to explore with the client. which again, when we think about it, is completely daft, because we can never be prepared for what a client is going to bring to us. So the idea that we only should feel competent and that we should know and that we should feel safe means that we are really limiting what within the client's lived experience we can actually explore with them. So the more we deconstruct this, the more ridiculous it becomes in a way. Whereas cultural attunement, a starting position with cultural attunement is saying, it's not that I'm competent in what the client is going to bring me. It's not that I might have any previous knowledge, but my knowing does not come from knowing about the client. My safety doesn't come from the client and knowing about the client. My safety comes from knowing that I can contain it, whatever it is that might come up. Yeah. Our ability to go anywhere that the client takes us, or be curious and to go, I've got no idea what we're going to look at this session. I don't know where we're going to end at this session. My confidence or competence in being curious does not come from knowledge about the client. It comes from my ability to say, Myira, you can contain this. You are robust enough. You have a big enough emotional container to hold whatever the client brings you. And that for me is more important, because that's the being, that's the relationship. That's why the client is coming for counselling. The client is not coming for your expert knowledge on culture or anything about community. Your client is coming to you wanting to trust that you can safely hold everything and anything that that client is going to bring you. So for me, my competency then does not come from cognitively knowing something. My competency comes from my robustness and resilience to contain everything and anything that the client is bringing. Yeah. So that's the difference. That's the pivot. I'm moving away from competency and knowing into competency and being. And my competency then is not cognitively taught or learned. My competency is built and learned and experienced through the actual being, the actual doing of it, being in relationship with clients, which is why experience in this job is so important. Not experience through knowing, it's through experience of holding and containing our clients. Yeah. So thank you, Mona, for mentioning those, because I think it kind of highlights those two really important points. Anybody else with any reflections, thoughts, or questions then about cultural attunement? No? Okay. I'm going to go through the next section, and we'll go for our final break and then come back for section 4. Interestingly, it was mentioned, let me just bring up the right PowerPoint slide, thinking about, oops, there we go, in thinking about culture. So when I talk about cultural attunement, I'm talking about almost like identity attunement. So not just culture as a identity characteristic, but we are attuning to the entire identity of the client. And two ways that can help us to understand how we can best attune to our clients are through a couple of ways that we're going to talk about. We'll talk about the collectivist and individualist culture, which I think is Alina, you mentioned a moment ago. So we're going to talk you through that. Then we'll go for a break. And then in the last section, we're going to go through this dynamic of cultural closeness and distance in our therapeutic relationships. So in trying to develop and be culturally attuned or identity attuned to our clients, one really helpful framework that can help us to understand one of the ways in which a client's lived experience is influenced by is through a particular component of culture, which is this collectivist individualist culture. So when we think of the identity wheel, culture being one of the identity characteristics, if we kind of zoom into culture, there are many things to consider within culture. There's if you Google kind of the culture iceberg, there are so many components that make up our culture or cultures that we live in and exist within. But one of the ways that I think is really helpful to help us understand our clients' frame of reference or their lived experience of their culture is to understand how the client themselves understands their sense of self. And essentially, collectivist or individualist culture determines and influences whether a client sees themselves, or a person sees themselves, either as a collectivist identity, in which their sense of self is based around a we consciousness, or if a client or any individual is born and brought up and has internalized an individualist culture in which their sense of self is I. So their identity is based in them being an individual. So, as I've said, the identity wheel, we've zoomed in on the culture identity characteristic. And within the identity characteristic, within the culture characteristic, one way to help us understand a client's culture is to see, how do they think of themselves? Do they think of themselves as a we or an I? So in a collectivist culture, there is this we consciousness in which the identity of the person is based within a social and relational system, versus somebody that's been brought up in an individualist culture, their identity is based in the individual. And the easiest way then to figure out whether somebody has a dominant or predominant collectivist or individualist culture, which one influences their sense of self, is to listen out for how they refer to themselves. Do they call themselves or refer to themselves as a we or an I? And I could right now ask each of you to do the same. If I was to say to you, when you talk about yourself, which ones do you find yourself more familiar saying or more comfortable saying? Is it saying we when you talk about yourself, or I? So that's a really easy way just to kind of look for it in your clients, and equally think about this for yourself as well. So when you're filling in the culture part of your identity wheel, are you a collectivist or individualist in your sense of self? And the reason why this is really important is because it really influences then how we see ourselves and the boundary around our sense of self. And it's on the next slide, actually, a graphic about a visual about that boundaries. But ultimately, depending on whether we are a collectivist or individualist, our level of autonomy and agency might differ. So, for example, in a collectivist culture, because there is a sense of we, and because our identity is about we are constantly in relationship with other people, we have to therefore think about the group as a whole. Very often then, we have an emotional dependency on that particular organizational social group or community or family. And because of that then, when it comes to our level of autonomy and agency and what we can do for ourselves, decisions about our level of autonomy or whether we can do something or not is not just about thinking about ourselves as an individual, it's about going, is this best for the group or not? So again, I'm making up a random example here, but if you're part of a collectivist culture and you are, I don't know, 18, you've just done your A levels and you want to go to university, the decision about where you might go to university might well be dependent on what's best for the family and for the group, not what is best for you as an individual. And I use that as an example because having worked at a student counselling centre when I first not qualified, when I started on placement, when I was training, I often found that clients that were coming to therapy wouldn't, their presenting problems were not always out of a particular issue individually, but rather because they were trying to navigate maybe being on their own for the first time, having to operate from an individualist perspective when they were coming from a collectivist family group dynamic. And or equally a client who might have chosen to live away from home to go to university, and they might have done that against their family's wishes, or their family said, fine, you can do that, but now they're really struggling because they're away from their collectivist group or community. Just as examples I'm giving here, but these are ways in which we can understand that when somebody lives within and their sense of self is very much based within that group system to make a decision that means that they move away from that group, that might be really difficult to do. Another example is, having worked with many clients over the years that come from collectivist cultures, if they're coming with marital problems, for that individual, divorce is not an option. Because being part of a collectivist culture, when decisions and autonomy and decisions and what is best is placed upon what's best for the family, an individual decision to divorce isn't, if that's not going to be best for the family, that person then will feel that that's not a choice for them. Okay, so this is what I mean about a collectivist culture. A collectivist sense of self is going to influence and impact what your client in front of you may or may not feel is available to them in terms of choice. And if we then come from an individualist culture in which we go, if you're in a bad marriage and you want a divorce, go get a divorce. If we're sitting there with that kind of opinion or lived experience ourselves, it will be really important then to note and to be mindful of then how our individual level of autonomy and choice and agency might not match to the same degree with the client. And so what might be available to us as choices may not be available for the client. And so we might find ourselves then trying to push a client into making a decision that actually goes against their culture, their sense of self. Yeah. Or vice versa, we might come from a collectivist culture and we might have a client who's going, yeah, I'm going to get divorced. And I don't know, I might be sat there in my collectivist culture and going, oh no, but what about your family? Or what will the in-laws think? And what will your parent, I could do the opposite again as a made up example. But it's noticing, if I'm coming from a different end of this dimension with my client, if I'm collectivist and they're individualist, or they're individualist and I'm collectivist, that we might be differing in the degree of autonomy and choices and decisions that we have available to us. And we have to be mindful that, again, we are not utilizing our power over our client to tell them or to push them into making a decision that we think from our collectivist or individualist position is okay, because it's okay for us. It doesn't mean that it's available to the client. So a collectivist sense of self then very much is about, rather than being seen as the individual, identity is within this social relational system. So any decision I make is about what is a decision that's best for the group, best for that family. My individual needs might not always be met, because it's almost a bit like for the greater good, for the bigger group. We're doing things that are best for the collective group here. At the other end of the spectrum, then, we have what's called this individualist culture. And that very much then is the opposite. It's an identity based in the individual. So the sense of self then is about an I. And therefore then, belief is placed in individual decisions. There's a greater choice, more individual autonomy and agency. So again, thinking back to that personal, an individualist person, a person from an individualist culture may have greater personal power than somebody that's from a collectivist culture. So you're starting to see where we, our client, and start to notice where power in here might get played out. Okay. So as I said, this is one way of understanding how the degree to which a client has autonomy and power and personal power, or the degree to which they might not have personal power, but they have a lot of power within relationship. So a collectivist culture essentially places a lot more power in that group power within relationship, and not so much in personal power, whereas an individualist culture is going to place greater weight on personal power and also on that group power. They can hold both simultaneously. So I think it's a really useful way just to think about how we can think about the culture of our clients. And this for me is just a really useful graphic to think about the boundary around sense of self. For a collectivist, the boundary around self includes the self as we, it's me and others together. So it's me and my immediate family, maybe. Whereas an individualist culture, There's me and the boundaries around me as an individual, and then there is the boundary around every other single person. So each of us are operating from a place of personal power. So when we're an individualist, each person is operating from a place of personal power, first and foremost. In a collectivist culture, we are operating from a place of collectivist power within relationship, power within our group. And that type of power is what's utilized more, okay? So just a graphic just to illustrate the difference between the type of power that might be utilized if you come from a collectivist culture versus an individualist culture. I think that's really important then, so that when we're culturally attuning to our clients, we are starting to recognize which of the types of power our client is more likely to utilize and lean into. Yeah. There's no point trying to work really hard with a collectivist client for them to feel empowered and for them to kind of think about themselves only and to go out into the world and do what you want to do and forget what your family say. It's never going to work. Not that we would do that anyway, but you can start to see how we've got to work with how the client sees their sense of self first and foremost. And it's from this place can we start to see how do they then experience power. Okay. So that's the piece that I wanted to look at in terms of collectivist and individualist. We're going to take, let me stop sharing. We're going to take a break there, short break now, and then we're going to come back for the final section, thinking specifically about cultural closeness and distance. Before we jump into the break, though, just want to check in with everybody. Any questions at all about collectivist, individualist at all? Was that clear? Yeah, see heads nodding. Yeah, okay. So what we'll do is we'll go for a break now. Where are we at? We're kind of 7 minutes past. If we come back at oh, I can't do my maths. If we come back at 25 past, and then that final 35 minutes, then we're going to run through cultural closeness and distance. Okay, so we're back at 25 past.